Welcome. Okay, you start.
Welcome. You said welcome, so I figure I should do the same thing. I'm David
No.
Pinsof, and I'm here with Dave Pietraszewski.
Mm.
And what is this? What are we even doing here?
This is a podcast.
Okay. What is it called?
Let me look it up. Well, actually, I don't know. Okay, it's evolutionary psychology. Oh, it's evolutionary psychology, the podcast. Okay.
Ah, that's what it is. Okay.
Yeah.
And the tagline is actual evolutionary psychology by actual evolutionary psychologists.
They must be around here somewhere.
Yep. I think one of them might be in this episode.
Okay, well, enjoy. David, good to see you.
Good to see you too, Dave. We have an awesome guest with us today. We have Michael Moncrieff, who is a scholar of international law, who has done field research in war-torn Croatia. We talk about so many fascinating topics. We talk about terrorism, interstate violence, even drag queens.
We do. Yeah.
Yes.
And Michael has just incredible, fascinating stories across a wide range of human experiences, works a lot with international humanitarian lawyers in dealing with international armed conflict and terrorism. This is a really wide ranging, interesting, and important person. And we just loved having him on.
It was a lot of fun. I think you'll have a great time listening to it.
Enjoy. So I found the record button, so we are now recording. Michael and David, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Michael, today we have Michael Moncrieff. Wait, did I say it right? Michael Moncrieff.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, great. I'm done. David, take over.
Okay. uh, Michael, you have been working in the same vicinity as the UN. Is that correct? In
Yeah.
conjunction with the UN and with international diplomacy?
So I've been working on a project in Geneva.
Mhm.
And when you're working on a project in Geneva, it's very hard not to constantly run into the international community when it comes to issues like human rights and international law.
Okay.
So formalistically, no, but we've been doing a lot of discussions, a lot of roundtables, a lot of back and forth with folks from the UN and also the Red Cross. So it's kind of one big incestual community out there with with international law, international policy.
Mm.
So it's been a great opportunity out there.
I had a
Would
chance to. Oh,
uh,
sorry. Go ahead, David.
I just wanted to ask the question, are you the only evolutionary psychologist in the international law, international relations space?
As far as I know, I'm sure there's some of us lurking out there, but no, that as far as I know, yeah, and you can definitely feel that when you're in meetings with folks
Mhm.
from the UN and that there's very little EP voice coming through in those meetings. So, but it's a really exciting opportunity because then something kind of simplistic ideas from EP can be really useful because you can say,
Mhm.
hey, what about this? And it's like, wow, we never thought about that before. I can give you one quick example. I was on a call that was discussing why militant groups refuse to comply sometimes with international law, with international humanitarian law, which is the law of war.
Mhm.
And so the speaker was talking about religion and how religion might play a role, and just a simple question like, well, what do you think is the fundamental motivational differences between these collectives? And it kind of, then you hit a silence.
Mm,
And so it's interesting too, because like on that side, they don't really talk about motivational things in
Mhm.
international law. There's been a lot of people that have said, oh, we'd love to pursue some of those ideas. But no one's really thinking that way yet. So yeah, so some simple things that in the kind of the perspective that evolutionary psychologists take for
Mhm.
granted oftentimes are just really useful for thinking through those things.
So
is it?
that's pretty mind-boggling to
Yeah.
me that a group of people who are trying to understand and predict and put a stop to terrorism, militant groups, violence, that they are essentially blind to the motivations behind it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still very, very prevalent, kind of a standard social model, right? So, this idea that learning plays a big role in
Hmm.
militant groups is definitely apparent from some of like the ICRC, the Red Cross. Their kind of strategies towards getting groups to comply with international humanitarian law are oftentimes based on education. So how can we talk to these groups? And there's some hints of ideas about incentives in there.
Hmm.
However, which is kind of more of an institutional type approach. But for the most part, it's still maybe if we talk to them the right way, if we communicate this information in the right way, then we can get these armed actors to comply with international law.
Hmm. So
So
it's all been
rather
a
than
big misunderstanding, in other words. They just,
um, yeah, a big misunderstanding. Yeah, there's a little bit of that naivety when it comes to like how best to approach it. And
okay.
and so I wouldn't say that they're that bad as thinking like, oh, all we have to do is teach them in a classroom and they'll behave better.
Hmm.
However, I do think that there's still a bit of a hint of like, oh, if we can just convince them that civilians, if they protect them, then they'll get benefits, for instance, at the negotiation table. And first of all, like you kind of start with this idea that every group wants to negotiate, which I think is also implicit in a lot of this stuff, especially with terrorism that I've been working on, is kind of this
Hmm.
implicit thing like terrorism is always for bargaining when
Hmm.
there might just be purely other reasons such as the destruction or depowering of other groups.
Hmm.
So yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there, a lot that's not been really discussed yet in the literature.
Well, ideology. So and we'll eventually get to who you are. uh, Hi. But I'm really happy we're just like launching into this. So David has this paper on sort of ideologies and political ideologies, and the idea is that I mean David can do a better job than me, but that political ideologies are largely confabulation for some underlying sort of alliance thing. And this is sort of one example of one of the things we've talked about in this podcast so far. One of the themes has been that people there's sort of strategic reasons underlying systems and for really important things like what you're talking about already that we're sort of launching into, you really study groups in conflict, really important life or death decisions, and you're talking to people in these rooms. I mean, I was in a room with you where they drafted part of the Geneva Convention talking to international humanitarian law. IHL, I got it right. There's a lot of acronyms.
Yeah,
My God. It's IHL and International Human Rights Law, IHRL. We're currently under IHRL, but if there was an armed conflict, we'd be under IHL. So hey, I've been practicing,
I
but
feel like I'm spreading the good word
of
of the international law, so I'm doing my
international law.
part.
Yeah. International law is really interesting. Actually, since I went to that thing, I've been like learning a lot about it, and it's very important with like lots of life or death consequences for like millions of people. So it's actually really good that somebody's doing the science. So thank you for doing it. But anyway, back to the point about confabulation and ideology. One question for you, Michael, is one of the things, like I said, there's been sort of a theme for this podcast, and I think it's just a theme of EvPsych in general, is there's sort of, you have to be humble and respect why people are doing things. And there's sort of this history, especially in social sciences, of sort of patronizing to the people on the ground making decisions. And, I think David's argument about political ideology and other arguments too, and I'm curious if you agree with this, Michael, and I'm curious like how this plays out for you, the particular range of experiences you're having in the people you're talking to. But this idea that sort of like, well, people are sort of dumb or naive. We need to tell them what to do, as opposed to like understand and sort of be an anthropologist about like, well, why are they doing this thing? And then figuring out from there what's the next step, as opposed to going in assuming that it's simple or it's learning or it's ideology, as opposed to like there's just this basic evolved psychology that has like basic needs and people are roughly reasonable even when they do terrible things like
Yeah, I have so much to say on this that it could take days, but I think I've seen it in both areas that I've worked in. So I've worked in counterterrorism now for probably almost a decade, and
Mm.
then before that, working on ethnic violence, and you see it in both of these areas. So with with terrorism and radicalization, particularly, you see that there's this constant debate about ideology and what
Mm.
role, and it's coming back again. So,
Mm.
um, and it's actually a really hot debate in the field right now. So, earlier models of radicalization were heavily ideological based. Like, the focus there was on changing the message if you wanted to prevent someone from radicalizing, or counteracting those messages and things. And a lot of the models of radicalization kind of put ideology at the core of this. And then you start to see problems along the way. More recently, there's been this idea of what the people have called like salad bar ideology, where you're getting these strange mix of like far right actors kind of adopting positions that Islamists would adopt, kind of neo jihadist positions.
Mm.
And all of a sudden, the folks in this field were like, whoa, 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 what's happening here? This doesn't make sense. And so then you have kind of this drifting away from ideology, and people saying, well, maybe ideology doesn't matter at all. And there's also kind of a problem there, because then it diminishes it so much to a point where it's like, okay, then why is it always there? Why is it always coming back?
Hmm.
So you have to account for it somehow. And then that's where the coalition building really, I think, and I align with you, David, a lot on this. So now there's another pushback. Just last week, there was an article out by terrorism radicalization scholar in the UK, writing on behalf of the UK government, saying, no, we really have to take ideology seriously. Look, it's a core driver of these behaviors. And so my take on this, from what I've done in radicalization, is that indeed it's more fundamental motivations that are kickstarting this process. And you can even tell this from like basic things in literature, like people that radicalize oftentimes are really ignorant of the things that they're talking about until they get to a later stage when they actually start to adopt, the ideology of the group. So the question is, what are those things doing? And I think
So just
they
to
have
clarify,
these, yeah.
so just to interject a bit. So what you're saying is that commitment to the group precedes ideology, that people are often committed to the group before they fully understand the doctrine or the beliefs justifying the group's existence.
Yeah, it seems like this is kind of generally how it goes. The person
Hmm.
is in some type of usually depressed state, right? So there's
Correct.
something that their life's not quite going the way that they want it to. And this is what like early descriptive models of radicalization always showed.
Hmm.
And then they start looking for what explains that state that they're in. And
Hmm.
oftentimes then they're in kind of our modern day ecology, social ecologies, you have all this information about ideologies and that. And I like to think of them as like explanation packages. So it's like the person hits upon these things and says, "Oh, that's a good explanation for what I'm experiencing, and that aligns with me." And it helps them identify. So it has a coordinational element, I think, helps them, and this is much of your work, helps them identify those actors that are on their side and that see the world the same way. It helps
Hmm.
them justify and explain to others. And I think that that's a really important role that's like still under researched, is like I have a very
Hmm.
strong feeling that hitting upon the right justifications green lights a lot of those harmful behaviors.
Hmm.
So I think, but the fact is, yeah, these lower the cost of action and increase the benefits of action, but I don't think that they're the core kind of organizational functional thing that's happening during radicalization.
What
So
is
they're not the prime. They play a role certainly
They're not the
in the
prime
causal
mover.
system, but they're not the prime mover.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
what is radicalization?
So that's a really good question. So I start my talk by usually recently by saying no one really knows. And there's in fact a whole literature on what is radicalization, and it's really messy. Essentially, it's radicalization has been defined as, and it has ideology kind of in the common definition, is the adoption of an ideology that prepares individuals for collective action towards violence. So it's this changing of ideas, of ideologies and beliefs in favor of a group toward collective action is kind of the first kind of idea. But the fact is that there's more written on. No one knows what this is.
Right.
So myself and a colleague, we looked at it from a slightly different perspective, and we tried to see like what's actually happening, because what is really clear is that there is like a functional change. So there's a systematic change in perception, in memory, in planning, all these different things that are kind of systematic throughout those individuals you look at. So there must be some kind of orchestrational organizing process for this. And if you look towards the EP literature and John and Lita's work, you see that emotions play a prime role here. And so me and my colleague looked at this and we said, what could be playing the prime role? And we went through many different examples of different types of things. And we finally settled on envy as this emotional system that we think, if you look at the envy literature that's out there, it matches very, very tightly with what's happening during radicalization, as far as all these different changes that the person's going through. And it matches the very essence of kind of radicalization, which is this depressed state. You have a depressed status individual looking at the world around them and saying, okay, how can I eliminate my competition? What can I do to bring them down to my level? And then, motivating the actions to do so, whether those are, really violent actions, or whether that's joining a militant organization to support them in doing violent actions. But when we kind of conceptualize radicalization, we actually used more of a game theoretic approach, which is just looking at how do people think about their relationships with others. And we see that that's also changing. And so there's kind of two things. There's like a risk preference change, where it's like, we have to do this now. Everyone should join us, because if we don't do this thing now, then we're not gonna be here tomorrow. So there's an action preference, this risk, taking on really risky actions that have to be done now. And there's also kind of changes in how they see others. So they see their social interactions as changing. Those that aren't participating are seen as like free riding or skirting. Whereas those that are signing up with them, there's a lot of gratitude flowing towards those individuals. And so what's really interesting here is we think that kind of game theoretically, what they're trying to advertise is that they're playing this really weird game theoretic game that's so weird that actually it's not studied very much, because the only optimal outcome is cooperation, which is the harmony game. And so what you're seeing here is like these agents are acting as if they're playing this ultra cooperative game that usually happens, like, let's say if your group's being attacked in a real warfare, the best coordinational thing is to come together and defend yourself. And that's kind of how they're talking about all these situations. So I'll stop there, because I could go on.
Yeah, it sounds like, I'm imagining obviously all of this science starts with a lot of assumptions or imagined scenarios. And what I'm hearing is this is sort of, all of these concepts are built for sort of some kid on the internet who sort of, is living in like somewhere sort of relatively anonymous, goes online and gets radicalized and like does some violent event. That's a different scenario than state level violence or conflict. And I know you looked at that too in your really interesting like history of being a researcher of violence. And I know you looked at like ethnic conflict in Central Europe. I'm curious, maybe, and this is a segue sort of into you too, because I think, I love how we just like delved right into the content. But so you have experiences studying ethnic violence too. Can you talk a little bit about that, and maybe either go right into that, or like, how did you arrive there? I mean, you've told me crazy stories that maybe, if you feel comfortable repeating or not, but how did you get into like, how do you find yourself studying ethnic conflict in a way that, you're really kind of there?
Yeah. So my early passions were really on religion, evolution of religion, evolution of morality that kind of comes along with that territory, and conflict. And so those are kind of all married together during periods of ethnic conflict. And so, so I was in grad school. I was gravitating towards these areas, and as I was moving towards that direction, I was particularly really interested in like what happens to people's moral reasoning during periods of rising ethnic conflict. And so the former Yugoslavia provided like a really beautiful kind of natural social experiment to go do interviews and to do cognitive experiments out there.
When was this?
So this would be oh my gosh, a decade ago,
Okay, yeah.
which is wild. So yeah, so about 2015, 2016, I was out in along the coast of Croatia and also in the kind of rural villages that are from the coast towards Bosnia, so Zadar to Benkovac. And yeah, and so what we were really interested in is and inspired by too, which I've been teaching a class and I tell my students, and I think David, we talked about this when I saw you about how like coordination is such a an incredible thing, but no one notices it's there. I mean,
Hmm.
there's been beautiful research here by Thomas and Pinker and their
Hmm.
crew. And I saw, I think Pinker's working on a new book to come out this fall that's also dealing with coordination. So I'm super excited
Hmm.
about that.
Yeah,
But it's one of those things that we just take for granted, and I was kind of
totally.
beating my students over the head with it recently. Yeah, what were you gonna say?
Yes, I think it might be worthwhile for people who might not be privy to this stuff what coordination means, what common knowledge means, why this is the water we swim, why it's underrated.
Yeah. So I think I'll start with why it's underrated. It comes so naturally to us that it's just
Hmm.
like we're completely blind to the fact that this is what's happening around us all the time.
Hmm.
But the simplest kind of coordinational game is just trying to align individuals towards the same goal, and that's it. That I mean, you're trying
Hmm.
to achieve a state of kind of common knowledge, which is this idea that I know that this other person knows that I'm willing to engage in this action, and vice versa, kind of ad infinitum. And I'll give you
Hmm.
like a great example of this that I love using in my classes is the fall of the Soviet Union in Poland. So there's this great video, it's very short online, where this guy is discussing how they would go around and put these radio transponders from Radio Free Europe throughout people's homes. And they wouldn't tell those individuals that they had these transponders or not because they wanted them to have deniability. So they would kind of hide them in people's homes and everything. And so one night, all these people were frustrated and fed up with the system. And one night, they said, "Hey, if everyone listening would go on to their lights and flick them on and off." And so what happened is you saw all these lights flicking on and off throughout the city, and within a couple days after, you had these mass protests and everything. And what it did was everyone had their kind of private knowledge to themselves, but they didn't know that everyone else also had the same inclination to let's get rid of this government. Until you saw these kind of coordinational signals out there, which helps everyone kind of converge and provides that recursive knowledge state of, oh, I know that they know that I know, and vice versa.
That's fascinating. So,
This,
so
yeah,
this was turning on and off one's lights.
yeah,
This
something very
served as a
basic.
signal. This served as a
Yeah,
signal that I am unhappy with the regime,
And I'm not
yes,
alone. And it's that
and I'm not
other
alone.
people.
exactly.
Yeah. And this
That's
is why,
fascinating.
and this is, I mean, Michael, you might know this history better, but like when I teach like even intro psych, it's sort of like one of the reasons why like dictators crack down on protests that seem even very small is this concern that it can create common knowledge of if everybody's miserable but isolated, nobody knows how many of us there are. But the second that other people say, oh, there's other people, like even the classic Solomon Asch studies, which actually do replicate, as I understand,
Hmm.
this thing of, so they show people, they bring people into this room and there's just like three lines, and one of them is obviously like shorter than the other ones. And the people who are participating in the study think all of the people sitting next to them are all participants, but they're actually in 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 cahoots with the experimenter, and they say the wrong line. And the question is, what will the actual participant do? Will they conform? And sort of remarkable levels of conformity one gets. I mean, it's not 100%, but it's still like pretty high, it's like 30% or something, even more. And then depending but you you don't get conformity if at least just one other person doesn't agree. So and it doesn't, so it's really just the fact that I'm alone versus everybody else. And if you have at least one other person, that makes a huge difference. It's like the dam is broken.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Do you think that the flicking on and off of the light, do you think the seeming disconnect from the content of I'm unhappy with the regime is a feature and not a bug, in the sense that if you're trying to coordinate with other people that you're opposed to the regime, um, it is very risky for you to say that out loud in a conspicuous way, I hate the regime, you might get imprisoned or executed as a dissident. So people have to somehow find a way to coordinate and create common knowledge that they're on the same team against the regime without those signals getting picked up on by the authorities. And so the beauty of this signal of turning on and off one's lights is that its disconnect from the content is a design feature, and that it makes it difficult for the authorities to catch on to what is being done. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is just a really cool example because it really gets you to conceive of this. But there's all sorts of interesting things in this area that are done with cost and benefits, how those influence individuals. Even something as simple as, I know there's some research like sharing the same locality or accent can actually shift your ability to coordinate a bit better. And also people that are in relationships very long periods of time have much greater ease of coordination with tasks than that. So it's a really cool thing that our mind is picking up here. But I totally agree with you that yeah, indeed, it's because there's that ability still for plausible deniability that comes into this, and Pinker's work, where this kind of underlies a lot of things, like, he always talks about, would you like to come up and see my etchings?
Yeah, I
And
was
of
thinking
course, like
exactly
this kind
that.
of
Yes,
indirect
exactly.
speech. Yeah.
Yes.
So there's, I mean, it's so pervasive that my students in a recent political science class that I taught, I didn't realize, but I was kind of beating them over the head with it every couple classes, because I was like, guys, look, this is a coordinational like issue right here. Like, all right, coordination again. But it's really fascinating, because like our entire global economy works off coordination. That's why when people talk about cryptocurrencies, people are like, well, there's no value there. And it's really hard to explain to people that coordinational value is a value in itself. And so, Hardin did a bunch of work here where he showed that, there's exchange value from coordination, that there's, collective power that comes from coordination. So all these things are like crucially important, particularly in the startup of mass conflict. It's really a coordinational thing, and then it becomes more of a cooperative endeavor as it builds. But yeah.
But we got distracted from the light flicking to Croatia. Yeah.
I got distracted.
Yeah.
No, it's
moth
great.
to
No,
the
no.
mic.
It's really great. I mean, this is also
Yeah.
one of the reasons why we're doing this podcast, is to just get a feel of what it's like, what people just like discussing science is like, and this is what it is like. But I want to get us back. So get us back to Croatia and what you're doing there and what you're experiencing. Yeah.
Yeah, so in Croatia, what I was really looking for is, so there's some theories of morality that put coordination as kind of a centerpiece. So it's this idea that, I'm willing to give up certain behaviors so long as other people coordinate on those same actions. And in doing so, we all, kind of benefit. We might give up, and maybe we'll be, a bit hypocritical at times, but we kind of give up. We take on some cost for kind of a wider benefit. So there's, without getting too much into it, there's all these coordinational theories of morality. And so what we were looking at in the former Yugoslav is, could there be differences? What you oftentimes see with ethnic violence in particular is that it tends to start in rural communities and move to more urban environments. And I'm not talking about like massively urban environments, but urban environments of, a couple 100,000 people a lot of times. But it really starts in, oftentimes the initial kind of sparks start in rural communities. And so we were thinking, one of the things that you have as a difference between rural and urban communities is this heightened sense of pre-existing coordination. So people have frequent encounters with each other. They know each other very, very well. They spy on each other. They gossip. So there's a lot of expectations there. And so we were wondering, indeed, you see these moral differences too, right? Where there's higher moral condemnation in kind of rural communities versus these urban communities. So we were looking at, does coordination play a role? And we kind of operationalize that as, what do you think your neighbor would do in this circumstance? How would they think about this? And, urban environments, people don't know their neighbors as much, or they might have a few pools of people, their work colleagues, their friends, but it's not these extensive networks that exist, these imbricated kind of overlapping networks that exist in these rural communities.
Yeah, and so you're
So what are,
going to, so you're actually going to these communities and talking to people face to face. Is that right?
yeah, and so yeah, so we spent a lot of time in the urban and rural communities doing interviews. We did about 60, I think, interviews.
Right. And this is about the
And
history of this conflict that they had just gone through relatively recently.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, the conflict officially ended in 1995. However, as with any conflict, it lingers, and the after effects linger for a very long time. And I mean, the memories are still extremely fresh in all those regions. If you go down there, especially to rural communities that were the hardest hit, the memories were yesterday of losing a loved one, or of losing your home, or et cetera, these terrible things.
And can
So
just
yeah,
just to like, I mean, just like the human experience. I mean,
yeah.
in a rural community, is it that there were people that they knew, or it was like people that were distant but that came that were actually doing the harm to them?
Both.
Wow.
So yeah, so there were some kind of the early initiation in that region was some kind of paramilitants from Serbia that came in and started stirring up trouble. But once the war got fully underway, it was very much like when talking with participants, it was like, oh, I knew this group of guys since
Wow.
I knew them since they were children, and now they're and then one interview in particular, I remember she said, this particular uh, group would come to her, and they would show up at her house and demand that she cook for them, and then they ended up actually killing her husband in the end.
Wow.
And so yeah, so it was a lot of personal relationships with these people, and that also is why it's so in particular in every ethnic conflict, it's so
Mm.
striking, like how personal these relationships can be and how quickly they can, like the moral sphere shrinks. And so what we were doing is looking at what role does coordination play? If you have heightened coordination in these places, could you necessarily shift to a new set of kind of moral rules very quickly, which you have more difficulty doing in an urban environment or a less coordinated, pre-existing coordinated environment? Um, and so we think plays a partial role, excuse me, in this shift towards violence that you see in those communities. So we were looking at that, and also some of the narratives, and looking at the field of coalitional psychology is quite new still, and this is 10 years ago. And so we were looking at, do these narratives support some of the initial predictions from the field of coalitional psychology with an EP?
What was that like? Because, we had an anthropologist actually, and we can maybe know about your background because I don't know if it was in anthropology or psychology or both.
Yeah, I was in psychology early on, and I worked
Mhm.
doing like cognition and experiments with human robotic interactions and like these very technical experimental designs. And then I went to anthropology, social anthropology later on.
Yeah, because I mean, what was that like, just like either scientifically or personally, to like go to this place, hear these stories,
Yeah.
and this is not an abstraction. And I mean, there's two ways to think about it. One is, um, you know, one thing I like about EvPsych is that I feel like it sort of rises to meet all the wonderful and horrible things humans are capable of,
Mm.
right? Like it's not sort of bullshitty to genuflect towards David. Like it's just sort of like as good or bad or mundane or remarkable in both good and bad ways people ever get. I think like there's sort of evolutionarily informed theories of that. So one question was sort of like, even though that's true, did it feel like, oh wow, like this is real, this is like real people had horrible experiences, and like the science isn't adequate to meet the richness and horror of these experiences, or not? Maybe you were like, oh no, this all fits, whatever. And then the other question is, so that's the scientific question, and then the personal question was sort of like, I mean, not everybody gets to experience that, and I don't know if that changes you or the way you think in it. I don't know if you carry that experience forward. I would imagine it's got to have an impact on you. I'm just curious how that has changed you as a person or scientifically.
Yeah. I think So I'll try to address it. There's so many things that come to mind. So the first one, and it's a very mundane one, is when you take, the first time you go to some rural community and you have like you've been working on this research for over a year now. You've got all these excellent translations of like the best, you try to look for the best measures, and one of the ones that I was using was this measure of ethnic affiliation. And it was supposed to be like the best one used in the world, thousands of articles published on it, and take it to this rural community, and the people are filling it out around a kitchen table, and the one just starts laughing. And she's like, "What the hell does this even mean? This is so stupid." And then they're all talking about it, and they're all like mocking the scale. And when you look at it and you're looking at it from their perspective, you're like, yeah, this doesn't match. This doesn't work here. So I think from a very like though that was the initial thing that was like, oh, the benefit of doing field work is, you see, does this work? Does it not? And then as far as it was really interesting is when I first arrived, we were starting to kind of organize interviews, and it took a long time. I was there almost a year. It took a long time to get from our early kind of gatekeepers in these communities to actually speaking with people that have been really, really affected by the war. And that only came towards probably the end of the time that I was there. And that's when it was like all of the most horrific stories and experiences were kind of put together at once. And I remember in one particular interview, it was very, very difficult. It was a lady that, had just experienced every hardship of the war, lost her husband, lost her brother and her nephew in front of her, had watched that happen, went to testify for war crimes. And just listening to her experience, and also having a colleague of mine just break down crying. There's no way to prepare for that kind of situation. And that obviously like will always last with me, and it shows you you don't always see the importance of social science research because it's so disconnected, and you really hope to make some type of impact, even if it's really, really tiny. So those experiences were definitely, and it was during that time too where what was really kind of bizarre to me is toward the end of the time I was out there was when here in Orlando, where I'm at right now, was the Pulse nightclub kind of massacre that killed almost 50 individuals. And a lot of my friends worked there as bartenders and other. And so I came back to Orlando after for a short visit, and I was meeting people that had been there that night and listening to their stories. And I was like, oh my God, this sounds just like what I've been listening to in Croatia. And so there's also a lot of similarities in that regard, and that really hit home because I was like, wow, it really even gave me even a different perspective on the people I was talking to out there and really living through in a much fresher way, what they had been through. So yeah, I mean, that kind of work is really, and it also just teaches you so much. Being in a place, you get this, you understand why the great ethnographers were so interesting for the data that they produce, because it's like you get such an experience of being in a place. You get to understand the quirks and the nuances and how people socially organize, and that you just can't get through reading or trying to hypothesize your way through that. So
one of the themes of this has been also like listening to people who haven't been heard. And I feel like that's sort of a common thing through through some of your work. I remember you also told me there's like you've done research on like Stonewall, or have you done research on Stonewall, or was this just things you looked into?
No. So I did a bunch. I did one article that has done really well, and it was on the kind of the natural emergence of the drag queen phenomenon and what led to that. And it was just like the right type of social constraints in the gay community that we think kind of led to the opening up of this pathway towards status building. And that was one way of adopting this really aggressive outward persona that was like walking through the streets. We're talking like 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, in women's clothing, and standing up and being so formidable as to take on that challenge. And a lot of these individuals in its early history were really kind of down and out characters in the gay community. They either were living on the streets, had very little money, they were kicked out of their families' homes, etc., detached from their social connections, had very little money, little kind of attractiveness. So that was one way of adopting this persona and becoming this fighter for these communities was one way to build status if you were good enough. And that's, we think, is kind of what the initiation, which again ties back into Stonewall and everything there. So it's a really fascinating history in that regard.
So the idea is that, and I think this is, I'm just parroting what you've told me in the past, but the idea is that it was such a high cost thing to do. But it was sort of, you were willing to, these people who were down and out did this thing. It was sort of they sort of basically proverbial put a target on their back for
Yep.
the group in some sense. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it's funny actually how it came about. I was my colleague, a good friend of mine, Matthew Martinez. He was working on his dissertation work, and he was looking at these self-harm practices around the world. Particularly, he was looking in Mauritius at the time, and but really kind of globally. You see in particular social environments that there's these practices like taipusam, which is in Mauritius, where people will put hooks in their backs and like be pulled down the street. In fact, so bad it kind of ratcheted up over time that the government had to put kibosh on some of the more extreme practices. But he was working on a model of that, which is a costly signaling model, which suggests that, hey, these are low status individuals. By doing these really kind of grotesque but formidable enhancing displays to others, that they can gain some type of status and credit in the community. And as we were in a meeting about it, and I was like, wow, this really reminds me of drag queens. And it was like from that moment where we were like, oh, wait a second, let's see what we can go and do with this. And indeed, when you start to map out, it was right when the pressure on the gay community was building, is when you see the emergence of these individuals. And they always are kind of coming from this lower status position. And then only a few really make it. Even today, within that community, it's hyper competitive. Which I'll say one side note, I wouldn't say that the dynamics of today are the same thing that our paper describes. I think now it's become much more of a theatrics and much more of a competitive element that's taken on, which is kind of cool because it's cultural evolution at work right there. But when it really started to emerge, 1950s, 1960s, one of the earliest ethnographic accounts was from a University of Michigan grad student, I think she was at the time, where she went around with a drag queen through the streets of Detroit. And she said in one part of the book that she didn't want to walk near her because she thought she was going to get, the crap beat out of her. So you can see like the intense pressure and violence that was put towards these individuals, and by doing so, and also it's still part of the persona today, which is to be fierce, to be aggressive in that. But it's really interesting how that pathway kind of emerged from these just exact social constraints. And also note that these individuals just couldn't leave. Like, the community, once you join it during those periods, like you had no other social status opportunities outside that, because if you're gay, you can't, obviously, unless you're going to go back in the closet, succeed in other places. So it's just the right kind of constraints that can emerge and make these pathways towards status emerge.
It's a really lovely example of looking at phenomena in the world from this perspective, and, like, to your credit, Michael, figuring out sort of how can I deduce sort of what's going on in a way that is explanatory, and just lovely in the sense of, oh yeah, no, I see the deep elements of adaptations, cognitive mechanisms, human nature, however we want to talk about it, in this phenomenon, to, like, as a one way to understand it.
Yeah. And I think the one thing that, is interesting is you see the proximate psychology working. Like, there's no fitness payoff here.
Right.
And so that's also really interesting, because a lot of the other things that we tend to think of as status enhancing, we tend to think of, you can measure the reproductive payoff at the end. But here, it's the system is the proximate psychology is working. And so that's detached from that ultimate outcome.
Yeah. Super cool.
So I want to ask you a question that we've asked I think all of our guests. So you're in this field of coalitional psychology, ethnic conflict, terrorism, whatever you want to call it. So we got a bit of your origin story there, but we didn't get your origin story for why you think that evolutionary reasoning is useful here as a lens. So what brought you into the realm of evolutionary psychology, evolutionary thinking, of all the perspectives to take on these incredibly important issues? Why choose the evolutionary perspective?
Okay, so diving back into my former life, so I before I got into psychology or anything, I from very young age, I was about 12, 13 at the time. I started working, like, this is the weird part about growing up in Florida, right? You know, you see like the Tiger King and everything. That was kind of like part of my life when I was younger. So I worked at a lot of zoos and aquariums and with wildlife organizations when I was young, volunteering at first. And then when I was 14, I got my first positions as an employee. And kind of, I had this whole career before going into the social sciences of working with, oh my gosh, sharks, dolphins, alligators, snakes, birds of prey. And so it was really from those kind of biological origins that I was really interested in, like, oh, well, you know, what drives animal behavior? And over that, kind of naturally over time, I think, you know, especially when you're going through high school and then, you know, early college years, you start to think more about people around you, and you're like, okay, why do these people behave that way? So I think like the earliest influences on my thinking in this way were like E.O. Wilson's like early works and everything, and then of course Lita and John's. And the one thing that when I got into more in psychology, the initial thing was like, okay, but why? Like, I was so frustrated by this why question, which is like, you know, I remember taking a personality theory course and, you know, kind of memorizing the, you know, 30 some theories of personality. And I was always like, but why, like, why, even if any of these are correct, which, you know, I have a lot of skepticism. Why? Like, there was always that why, that nagging why question. And I think that's when, like, yeah, I mean, all the greats, Buss, Tooby, Cosmides, Kenrick, you know, started like voraciously reading all of that, and it finally provided really satisfying answers to that why question. And now I'm like, now that I've been working in this framework for so many years, I can't imagine not having that foundational piece, because it's always like where I start any question is even something that's very like, I'll give you a quick example. I've been working on this issue of that they're worried about in human rights law, which is this shifting towards more responsive policing activities and counterterrorism, towards more preemptive, what they call like the pre-crime space, and they have these administrative measures that are very common now and throughout Europe, the UK, France, even Switzerland's adopted them now, which is essentially like pre-crime measures, like if they suspect you of potentially becoming a terrorist, or affiliating with anyone that's suspicious, they can the executive can put these restrictions on you. And because oftentimes the human rights issue comes up here is because they're executive orders and not judicial ones, there's no recourse for getting these taken away. That's very satisfying in most circumstances. Anyways, so you know, I was given this kind of topic. We want to see, why is this shifting this way? Why is there more? And so immediately I kind of, you know, go back to the evolutionary perspective, and I say, okay, well, what kind of threat does this present? And I think terrorism in particular presents a very, like, I have a paper that talks about this, is that I think it's what the mind is keen to detect here, and it's using cues to detect it, is something that is really an all-out, all-or-nothing coalitional threat. And that's the kind of thing that these actors hit upon, those cues, even though they're sometimes single or just a small group of actors. If you can do these things that signal to others that you're going to come for the whole collective, like you're going to indiscriminately target them, you're going to do so with stealth and all these other things, and not, you know, announce when you're going to do these things. If you don't target the bargaining aggression wing, like the military, but you target the civilians, all these cues that traditionally throughout human history would have indicated that there was another group coming to eliminate your group. So you better be on high alert And you better, and what you see is all these downstream responses, right? These precautionary responses that we would expect. And so that was kind of the perspective I started taking there. And I have some experimental data that I haven't published yet. I'm a bit backlogged, but essentially what I was able to show is indeed when you present these cues to people that show that this is you kind of manipulate little features of these cues, you can get people much more willing to take precautionary responses and approve of administrative actions. Rather than wanting to, wait and investigate and do these things, which has ultimately, if you want to tie it back to policy, has these really important ramifications for human rights and things like that. So sometimes, highlighting those things can help people think through the problem easier and how to combat it. And also just knowing the foundational psychology there, what's causing that to be the case. So without evolutionary psychology, I definitely couldn't think in that regard. And I think that's what I think John Tooby said it, something about having superpowers with EP. And I really think that. I think, you can be in a room with a bunch of people, but if they don't have at least a flavor of that perspective, there's easy low-hanging fruit to go after, to say, hey, look, guys, there's a bigger picture here.
I want to chime in on that bit about terrorism, because that really piques my interest. I'm sure it piques a lot of people's interests. Terrorism is extremely evocative to the human mind. We can't stop paying attention to it as a society, despite the fact that objectively terrorism does not pose a very significant threat to us as individuals. The number of people who die from car accidents or heart attacks or any other cause of death you go through, terrorism is going to be at the bottom of the list. And yet the outsized emotional response it has on us is enormously influential. It was the main cause, arguably, of the Iraq War. This was, extremely expensive, both in time and resources. One of the biggest foreign policy blunders in a long time, arguably. All caused by a terrorist attack, which claimed the lives of far fewer people than most other causes of death. So, is your argument that our outsized response to terrorism is a kind of evolutionary mismatch? That in ancestral environments, seeing these kinds of attacks, this kind of damage, would have been a reliable cue of a coalitional threat that we needed to take action against as soon as possible and as swiftly and aggressively as possible. But in the modern environment, when we live in these mass societies, these cues are no longer accurate. That we're responding to these attacks with our Stone Age minds. When we should be responding with our modern minds. Is that the argument, or is it something else?
No, I think very much so. I think that there's. I'm always a bit hesitant to I don't know why. There's something that I think it's because it's used so often, that mismatch idea, that I tend to be a little precautious when I go as far as that. But yeah, in a sense. But I think there's a lot more to be said here. So it's funny that paper of mine is the least read. And I think I think I told you both at some point that I was joking that I think I wrote it for myself because the folks in the terrorism field, they see the evolutionary psych side, and I think they get a little turned off by it. And the folks in evolutionary psych don't know the full range of the argument that's happening in the field of terrorism to really know the nuance of what I'm trying to talk to. So just a couple things with that. I think that what's really interesting is you see that, and this has been a debate now pre 9/11, where there's never a satisfying definition of terrorism. And so this is a big debate in the legal field, in the policy field. And essentially everyone's somebody will say, well, this is the definitive definition. And someone will say, no, it's not, because it doesn't include this. And, and it goes back and forth. And so one of the things that I was trying to show there, which everything kind of comes together in this picture, is the fact that if these are kind of representational systems, right, and individuals have different social positions, And so, for instance, this is always the old saying, one person's freedom fighters and others terrorists kind of thing, which is crude, but it kind of gets you this idea that the different positions, social positions of the agents doing the evaluation will matter a lot to whether those systems are triggered or not. And so, if one of the things I think is that there's a lot of representational mismatch. There's not a very high degree of coordination amongst minds when it comes to what is terrorism, because some acts hit on certain cues. Also, you have the social position of the person doing the evaluation, and another number of other things that I kind of talk about in the article. But there's this mismatch, and I think that that's probably one of the reasons why. It's because terrorism hits on certain cues, and actually, when you ask people in experiments, is this terrorism or not? People do, when you give them a bunch of cues, they actually say, oh yeah, that's definitely terrorism. And when you degrade those cues, they're much less likely to say that that's terrorism. They might say, oh, that's mass shooting and things like that. So there is something interesting going on that you can see that's like this representation thing that's happening. So yeah, so there's, but then also it comes together with the precautionary idea too, is that once those things are hit upon, then you get this full-blown precautionary response. So it kind of brings together a number of elements, which is the representation thing, why we lack a good solid definition, which, by the way, when I was finishing the paper, I said, well, if this is much closer to what's happening with something like genocide, there should be less arguments about genocide because it's properly hitting a lot of these cues. And indeed, when you go look, there's much less argumentation about a definition of genocide. There's still arguments about what constitutes or doesn't, and and that's again comes down to the political agent that's doing that evaluation. But terrorism has a much more ambiguity in this regard. So yeah, so I think that's kind of it's definitely, that was a really fun paper to work on. But again, it's kind of like in between these fields. So that's where I was with that.
one just to follow up on the mismatch idea. Actually, Michael, since you invited me to this thing with the international human rights law, I've sort of been looking as an amateur into this. One thing I found was I'm really interested in conflict and war. And I realized I feel like I've been humbled reading through the expert analysis of these things. And one thing I found was there's something called the Watson Institute at Brown University, and they're trying to assess the costs of war. And to me, I didn't realize this, that, so for example, just a conservative estimate is that displaced people since 9/11, because of wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Philippines, Libya, and Syria, the estimate is 37 million people. And that's displacement, both internal and external. A conservative estimate of the death toll could be about 4.5 to 4.7 million, and especially children. And so, and this is the results of a reaction to this horrific event, right? But I think, like, in the sense of the importance of understanding the psychology, and this is not a partisan issue. I mean, there's this book, the Afghanistan papers. People even within the military. I personally know people who served in these wars. They're friends of mine, they're relatives of mine. Many of them are like, with Afghanistan being a good example of, like, what the hell are we doing there? They don't, the psychology of wanting retribution, retaliation, and the consequences of it. It's just interesting to think about how our evolved psychology, it feels good to sort of, like, not treat 9/11 like a police, something where we should just find the individuals who did it. And this might lead into some of this idea about, like, what groups are doing and the projection of group identities in international conflict. But regardless, of all these bad things, there's just this incredible amount of human suffering is done because of our evolved psychology, and I think understanding it better. Like these numbers, I was just shocked about, and I hadn't come across them before.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, to kind of add to what you're saying there, those like, and what David was saying, um, when you look at actual warfare numbers that are astronomical compared to terrorism,
Yeah.
and I say this being currently on the job market, so I'm trying not to downplay my hopeful next job, but really, I mean, there was a great book by Muller and Stewart that runs the numbers and does a really good job of showing like in this regard how terrorism is really really minuscule compared to other even risks, that we take for granted every day. It's a very, very low number, but it overwhelmingly, disproportionately evokes these really strong emotions. And so, as you were saying, David, I think understanding that retaliatory mindset and what is triggering that, and also having safeguards in place. This is really comes down to a policy thing, which is really, really difficult to do. But the problem after 9/11 was that there was that hair trigger response to do something, and a strong political response, which was totally reasonable from kind of an evolved perspective, like of course. However, in that regard, all these sweeping legislative pieces have gone into, especially in the Western world, that were never really thought that heavily about. So you get a lot of laws overlapping with other laws. You have all these in international humanitarian law dealing with the law of warfare. You see this huge issue when the Bush administration decided to declare terrorist groups as organized armed groups under international law. So thus kind of triggering this whole new legal framework where instead of using a police framework for going after these individuals, you could now use a targeted approach. And what's kind of happened in the legal field since then is that they've been trying to figure out what to do with that because it became a new legal reality for them. And it's really, in the recent years, really sent the field into, and now we're even getting into murkier waters when we're dealing with, more cyber terrorism. What they're preparing for now is, war in space. So these are even going to be looking less and less like traditional wars used to look, like World War I, World War II, and preceding wars, where it's very clear on the battlefield who's who. And so this raises a whole like plethora of new problems for international law, which, in my position, I think can really only be satisfactorily resolved if you start to understand the psychology behind these things. Why do people coordinate around certain laws when other ones just poof, you could put as many laws in place as you want, no one's going to follow it. And especially at the international legal stage, at that arena, you're dealing with purely coordinational problems. Because there is no third party to police it. So it's not like domestic law where, you have at least some semblance of a court system and all these things that can hold people to account and to monitor and sanction behavior there. It's really based upon coordination games and who's willing to push. And so now, there's this new debate going on in international law, which is like, is it worth, have we failed? Has the international legal framework failed? And now you have a lot of debate about that from both sides, obviously. But I think, yeah, it's getting us into a new area where we need to, I think, as far as my perspective, a lot of, I was talking to a friend of mine that's an international lawyer, and I said, actually, if you're interested, because he was talking to me about what areas should he study up on to have more of a social science background. And I said, a lot of this is game theory. A lot of this is actually, looking at how actors coordinate and when discoordination or miscoordination occurs. And so there's some really interesting things that need to be, there needs to be an emerging field now, which is the social sciences integrating with international law if it's going to survive, I think.
Is that discouraging to, I mean, I remember sitting in the room of the international human rights lawyers and like them laughing about how much, powerful countries just ignore, the ICRC or the ICC or any of these acronyms that are sort of,
Yeah.
you know, um, is that discouraging for you, or
Hmm. I mean, me, huh, that's interesting. And not for me personally, and I'm trying to think why. I think it's because I see the broader game. And I
mm,
think it's like it's just like any other social interaction. And this is another thing too that I think is oftentimes diminished when speaking in an IR, international relations type perspective, is that these individuals are decision makers, just like when we study human psychology. And I think that there's always this disconnect, especially amongst many political scientists, many international relations scholars. I just saw a piece, I haven't read it yet, but I saw the abstract. It looked really interesting. It just came out a week or two ago that is applying EP to international relations. So I'm looking forward to reading that. But I think there's this idea that because it's states interacting, that there's something that's what is the word I'm looking for? So divergent from an emergent phenomenon that
mm,
can't be reduced at all. When a lot of the same things you see with world leaders, I mean, just is coming down to human psychology. I guess I stay positive when I think that maybe this coordinational configuration that we have now is not the most optimal given what we face coming up. However, does that mean that there can't be another solution? I don't think so. I think that there are ways of crafting it in such a way where there can be more optimal solutions along the way. So I don't think throwing out kind of the baby with the bathwater is correct. It just needs different perspective, needs fresh perspectives as well. Because if this legal system was really developed at a different time, the the earliest ideas here were coming out of the Great World Wars and looking at how states coordinate and how different actors what role do they play. And it was only until the kind of the more modern period where you had this notion of non-international armed conflicts that's become now the priority mainly of the field, which is all these armed actors that are popping out like in Syria and other domains where the folks looking into these conflict situations can't tell who's who. And so now their very clean kind of legal system that they once had is facing a lot of challenges, and the question is how do they cope with those challenges? And then everyone kind of presents their own logic behind what's a new way of kind of going about this. But a lot of it kind of spins in circles without this kind of outside input from social scientists. And I think it was at that meeting where we had even a political scientist say, all my years of working in conflict, I've never been invited to talk to anyone in international law. And so I think that like right there is really interesting, how there's such a disconnect that you don't get that back and forth a lot of times. So, but I'm hopeful. I don't know. What is your perspective? Both of yours. I mean, maybe I'm tend to be more of an optimistic person, so that's why I think I can deal
yeah.
with terrorism and conflict more. But
Yeah, I mean, I think for me at least, since I was invited to this thing, I've been sort of shocked at, the degree to which I am like a very like I'm an American. I grew up, like I am not a very partisan person, and I sort of knew, like the U.S. had sort of, installed the, like things in Iran and things like that, so I knew like we had sort of a patchy record. But just sort of looking at the literature of when you have international humanitarian law, which is just reasonable things that like if you look at like Pew Research or other thing like, for example, the US population is overwhelmingly nonpartisanly supportive of like, not attacking civilians or not providing arms to groups that like attack civilians, and regardless of like the particulars of the situation. Um, but yet, this kind of thing across administrations, different political administrations, different sides. It's not a partisan thing. Just these things just happen. Um, I'm still personally sort of just realizing that the numbers of people affected are huge by sort of state action. And for me, I'm like thinking a lot about, we're not getting the evolved cues of, for example, like all these displaced people or all the like I was reading a conservative estimate is like for every person killed in a war, there's at least 4 non-combatants killed, just sort of like actuarially, just because of like disease, famine, displacement, etc. And yeah, again, if you like ask people on the street, like what do they think about that? They're the public is sort of right, but like countries, like our own country and other countries, whether we consider those countries good countries or bad guys, it's sort of a universal thing where I think countries and states are doing things that most of their citizens don't agree with. And for me, at least, I'm just sort of, I don't know if I'm optimistic or pessimistic, but I've been thinking a lot about why that is. And for example, like that we're not getting the evolved cues of all these people affected. You know, like I had no idea there were that many people impacted in our attack of Afghanistan, for example. And I'm not saying that, I mean, the Taliban is horrible, right? And there's no but, and the experience of seeing people of impacted or knowing that people are impacted would have been part of our evolutionary history. Like if somebody attacked us and did this horrible thing, we would retaliate, but we would also sort of know how much our retaliation impacted other people, and there's sort of a natural check on that. And I'm just sort of wondering aloud right now, stumbling around thinking about this issue a lot of the consequences of these sort of feel-good retaliations. Number one, are they rational? Do they actually make us safer? Are they effective? And that's an issue that's independent of even the science. And then the second issue is just sort of morally, is that the right thing to do? And how can the science inform sort of minimizing the moral horrors that are happening?
I'll say one quick thing. I think it's always a debate that swirls in my head is, for instance, how do you deal with a threat that is truly a predatory actor in the modern world? Because in the modern world,
what do you mean by predatory? Just
yeah. So if this is going into Aaron Sell's work and Lopez's work and Landers and all these folks. So this idea of if it's kind of the function of hate is what they've been looking at, and really that's to the goal there is to eliminate the individual or the group if that kind of their existence is negative for your fitness. And so in that sense, and that there's some really I have a book chapter coming out which is looking at radicalization as predatory aggression, and envy and hatred is kind of organizing emotional systems there. On the other hand, you have more bargaining aggression, which is more limited aggression, and this is as far as militaries go in Western societies, this is generally what most people think about our aggression, is that it's limited. We're going to use these as tactical things, strategic things to get something, to concede resources or land or political, concessions. And then there's a very different kind of state of mind that comes with those two different systems. And so the question is, when you're a modern state being aggressed by a predatory actor, how do you respond? Because on the one side, if you respond too weakly, then that encourages further aggression. But of course, we tie our hands under international law, and for very good reasons. I'm not saying for ethical, wonderful reasons, we tie our hands to a lot of this. And then when actors do kind of predatorily re-engage, there's this backlash, and then obviously you have this massive cost of lives that occurs oftentimes with that aggression. And so it's very interesting to me to think through, like, how do you most effectively respond to an actor like a terrorist organization, but do so, I guess it's kind of the walk softly and carry a big stick kind of ideology, I guess. But yeah, how do you balance that? And it's easier said than done, I think, a lot of times.
Yeah. And David, I know you want to say something. I just want to follow
Yeah.
up really quick. One thing I've noticed in looking at this too is it seems like there's also obviously the people who are in charge are often politicians. And there's a common knowledge issue of I don't want to look weak. So for example, even if objectively I'm going to make more terrorists by doing this really strong reaction, I'm worried about people looking weak to constituents, and not only constituents, but there's another group of people who want my position as a politician, and they are incentivized to say, "Hey, look, he's being weak. Dave's being weak because he's not attacking these people who attacked us." And so I am registering this of like, I need to survive and I want my position. There are people who are coming for me who are saying I'm weak. And so you can even see how people, even if every agent is sort of well intended, which is probably not the case, right? But even if they are, how that sort of just dynamic leads to a situation that favors erring on the side of satisfying the appetites, for example, of revenge, especially if we're not getting all the cues of the consequences of that revenge. And so I think it's a really important dynamic to understand for everyone if we're going to sort of address this, because there may be some real errors made because of the sort of institutional or structural monsters we've created. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So you made this really crucial and underappreciated distinction between predatory aggression and bargaining aggression. The way I see it is it's the difference between aggression as a means to an end, so as a means to get treated better, to get a better deal, to get some territory, to get some resource, whatever, versus aggression as the end in and of itself. The goal is to destroy. The benefit that the attacker receives from the aggression is the destruction or the disempowerment of the enemy itself. And unfortunately, I think it is very easy to confuse those two types of aggression because it's really hard to tell the difference when you're on the receiving end of it. If people are dying and things are being destroyed, it's hard to know what the motive behind that destruction was. But knowing the motive behind it is actually crucial for responding in the right way, because confusing predatory aggression for bargaining aggression could be extremely counterproductive. And vice versa, confusing bargaining aggression for predatory aggression could be extremely disastrous as well. Do you see this confusion being made in the international arena? Is this a danger? And how can we avoid making this mistake? And what is the best way to respond to each of these types of aggression?
Yeah, I mean, yes, definitely. There's definitely a confusion of these different types, and that, I mean, that is a not only from EP, but the idea of predatory aggression is a bit wider. There's been other studies in other fields that have looked. There's different neurosignatures of these different dissociated systems. So we know, I mean, there's a rich literature here in EP and also outside of EP on these different systems. I'll give you an example of when it can go wrong is in my own field of terrorism. And so there's this tendency in the literature to look at radicalized actors as doing it in response for retaliatory reasons. And so a lot of the idea here is that radicalization is what they say is a grievance-based thing. So people radicalize because something's been done to them by the state, by their local community. And so most of the models that are out there are very much reactive models. And so me and my colleague, what we did was we said, no, we need to start looking at this a little bit differently. In fact, some of this, first of all, is accepting the fact that aggression is good from an evolutionary perspective, not meaning for us, for ethics, but the sense of that aggression can be a really beneficial thing for certain actors. And so when you start to take this other perspective, what we've started to do is trying to shift the perspective of no, this isn't what radicalizing people are radicalizing is not in response oftentimes. They might give you those when you ask them why they've radicalized. And we think that might be part of the system to kind of look for excuses and justifications.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Because I'm just spitting this out spontaneously here, but it seems like it would be in the interests of a predatory aggressor to convince their victims that they're engaging in bargaining aggression.
Yes.
Does that make sense to you? Because if they're not aware of your predatory intentions, they might try to make concessions to you, and that's good for you, and then you'll just keep on attacking them.
Yeah.
Not
So
only, yeah. Oh, not only that, but, and this is Anthony Lopez's point, and we should have him on, is that leaders, the group that is doing the aggression is not a unitary thing either. And so there can be times where there is a small number of people whose interest is the aggression for their own benefit. So in some sense, they are being predatory, but most people are not predatory. And so they'll often, this is Anthony has this paper, Making My Problem Our Problem, where the point is to sort of spin this narrative of the group I want to be predatory towards. If I'm the leader, I tell my people who I want to support my interest in aggressing, they're attacking us. So you're coalescing support for my aggressive endeavors to support me by framing it as this is a case of retaliatory aggression. And you actually see this at every scale of social interaction, where there are agents who are differentially benefiting, and you see this even cross-culturally in small-scale social groups. There are just a subset of agents who will benefit from a raid, for example, or from intergroup conflict, and then the other people who will not. And their job, the people who will benefit to be belligerent, is to figure out a way to frame or encourage the people to at least go along with it, be okay with it, treat it as, yes, we are all attacking them. So I just want to say, like, that even, in some sense, that even further complicates the predatory versus retaliatory aggression, because it can literally be the case that the same set of people on the same side who are throwing the same spears or dropping the same bombs are actually, in one head, it's retaliatory, in another head, it's predatory.
Yeah, and I think I'll say here is that I think for so many years, the researchers that have been talking to radicalized folks have been assuming that the reasons and justifications that they're providing for their actions are the cause of those actions. And so we would like to, we wanted to go further, and I think this is a direction for future research. But also, our position is that envy is driving a lot of that home-based radicalization. That is kind of the core focus of that literature. And we think one of the things, the downstream things that envy does is it searches for these reasons and excuses and justifications, but to mask itself as well. So you said, you're advertising towards the victims, and that might be one group as a predatory actor to advertise to say, no, I'm going to stop if you guys just let up a little bit. And there's also, you're advertising towards those others, like you're saying, Dave, on your own side. And I think this plays such a critical role when you're seeing like ethnic violence start up. It's these predatory actors that are the first to move, and they get a lot of pleasure out of this. Is another thing that hasn't been discussed really much, is that you see across the radicalization literature is that excitement, joy, a thrill, and everyone kind of they've appreciated the fact that it's there, but why is it there? And it's like, I think it's really getting back down to some of the research that they've suggested with negative association values and how that can invert cost and benefits in the minds of those actors. So suddenly you heaving out cost and destroying your enemy is really pleasurable. Probably, close to sexually pleasurable. And that's where you get these weird. And so one of the things that's never been discussed is like, what is the one thing I always ask before I give a talk is like, what's the one thing that's really peculiar about radicalized people? And it's funny as members, I've given this talk in DC amongst policymakers and that, and they immediately hit on it. And my mom hits on it, but the people studying radicalization, they can't. They're like, oh, what is it? What is it? But it's really this idea of like, oh, that person looks crazy. Like if a person goes and commits a mass shooting at an elementary school, or any of these, a lot of these radicalized actors, the initial reaction to people is they can't wrap their head around why that actor would do that type of thing. And so I think that there's a lot to be said here about this inversion of costs and benefits, that radicalization, that's part of that process. And that's part of that process that envy in that case of domestic radicalization is kind of moving the agent towards those actions that feel really pleasurable and exciting and thrilling in order to eliminate or depower their adversaries.
Would you say that the international relations community is of the perspective that terrorism is generally motivated by grievance, by retaliation, by bargaining aggression, whatever you want to call it? And do you find yourself in the minority position arguing that no, this is not retaliatory, grievance-based bargaining, whatever you want to call it, but this is actually predatory?
Yes, yeah, 100%. And it starts to resolve a lot of the issues. In fact, the main kind of stream definition of terrorism is something that's religious or political, and I'm not going to verbatim get it, but essentially it's framed as bargaining aggression. It's to get some type of political gains, right? And that's kind of the mainstream view of literally what defines terrorism. I've seen just recently someone online saying, oh, they're not using the word terrorism correctly because that person's not, in our verbiage, not using bargaining aggression, which in my mind is completely the opposite of what I think these folks are doing. But it doesn't, to kind of the economical mind or our own rationality, that doesn't make sense. Like, unless you take into consideration this inversion of some cost and benefits, because it would just be befuddling. Like, why would someone give up their own life? And it doesn't seem to quite make sense unless it's for a broader political agenda. Then it's suddenly like you see the cost benefits and it matches your own intuitions about costs and benefits. And then it's like, oh, that must be what's happening here. And that's not to say that anger, bargaining aggression and predatory aggression can't co-activate. So there might, and then within a terrorist organization, this is not to say that everyone's radicalized. Some agents might be there for other reasons, for, self-interest or, numerous other things. And this is what we see in warfare all the time, is that you have, kind of the radicalized actors that start the conflict. And then the next in line, that suddenly the social environment shifts the costs and benefits. Costs start to rise of not joining, the benefits of joining start to, and that idea that flow of cost benefits can really have such a strong influence on behavior is also a bit underappreciated. Oftentimes you get this intuition that, oh God, there's got to be something more, right? Like, it can't be that selfish or that shallow of a psychology. There has to be some moralistic thing, or there has to be something else driving these people. And I think when you shift cost benefits, people will look for the reasons and justifications for those actions. And that's oftentimes that, this is like a Timur Karan type situation where these shifting costs and benefits of, in his regard, ethnification. But you see this shift, and then more and more people bandwagon and get on board. And even the ones that aren't truly on board, that will always have a problem with the aggression, they can't do otherwise, because to do so would be to kill, be killed yourself.
Do you think, just to ask a clarification question, do you think that the predatory versus bargaining aggression thing is actually that distinction, versus it's more of a almost proximate ultimate thing of predatory is people who are either certain that they're going to have to just exert a high cost, and it actually is for bargaining, but it's just that the bargaining is so distant, it just looks like it's just destroy everything. But in fact, it ultimately is. Is that and then just to be like devil's advocate, is that
Yeah.
I'm sure you've thought of this. Like, what would you say to somebody or that thought that it is in fact it is all bargaining aggression. It's just the severity of it makes the extreme version of bargaining aggression indistinguishable from just this berserk flip to destruction. I mean, I understand the point of just extermination. Like like that is different than bargaining for better treatment. Like if it's an interest to just have this entity destroyed, and maybe that's
Yeah.
ultimately the difference. But I'm just thinking, like, again, in this cartoonish way, if you look at somebody who is willing to blow themselves up on a bus, right? The question is, so clearly they're saying the benefit of destroying destruction is just intrinsic. But the question is that psychology? Because ultimately that destruction in that local case is a larger scale bargaining issue. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I guess it depends on it depends on too, because this is the perspective that a lot of people have taken is the altruistic perspective. So this idea that, these individuals are doing these things on behalf of a greater good for their collective. Um, I don't, in that regard, I find some of it difficult. You also have the collective action problem that kind of pops up there, which if you take more of the predatory actor route, you can bypass that fundamental problem pretty easily.
That's interesting. Yeah, so let's unpack
Yeah.
that a bit because that's a really interesting thought that hadn't occurred to me. So there is a collective action problem if the goal is to benefit the entire group, and that each individual has an interest of getting the benefits of the collective action without incurring the costs themselves. So you have this free rider problem. So if the goal is to benefit the group, it's hard to create the kind of selective incentives to mobilize the group toward the collective action. And insofar as any individual is willing to make a huge sacrifice for the benefit of the group, like say committing suicide, that's really puzzling to explain. On the other hand, if it is predatory and there and each individual gets a direct benefit from the costs inflicted on the enemy, then it's no longer so much of a collective action problem because any amount of destruction on the enemy is perceived as a benefit to everyone in the group automatically. So it's not really so much of a sacrifice at all if you're getting this immediate payoff of wreaking havoc on the enemy. Am I getting
Yeah.
that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, going back to the kind of the mismatch idea, that might be playing a role here as well, as
Okay.
what are the cues that are kind of calibrating these different systems. But also, David, I would say that, or Dave, sorry, I would say that I I think I start, how to say this? I think we've spliced things in such a way because we didn't have a functional perspective for so long
Mm-hmm.
that now when I'm starting to look, I think actually I'm getting ready to, like, for the next papers, getting more away even from the concept of envy because it confuses the heck out of everyone because people come to it with kind of their own preconceived notion of what is envy. B, they come to it with like, oh, I've experienced envy before. There's no way that, my desire for this something that someone else has could drive me to do this.
Right.
There's also just like, we're not sure where the boundaries of that system are, and it's very, very confusing.
Hmm.
And what I'm seeing more and more in my mind is kind of like in the virtual reality system that is my mind is like this cost benefit landscape.
Yeah.
And those individual actors in that cost benefit landscape, and what are the systems that are detecting and what are the cues that they're using to detect when those costs and benefits are shifting in such a way.
Right.
This isn't really addressing your question because like I don't have a good answer yet.
Yeah. Well,
Do you guys have any ideas there?
well, even like I think Aaron Blackwell had a paper. I don't know if it's out or whatever, but like even like suicide bombers, the cost of them doing that clearly, like the entities that want them to do that, there's all kinds of social structures of like your family will be financially better off. And if you like look at the data, like it's clearly that there's a manipulation of the cost benefit landscape, even for something as sort of crazy and irrational as suicide bombing. To even, because the person is still at the end of the day, it's like, I'm incurring the cost and the person next to me is not. And so there's all kinds of things around trying to get around that. issue of the evolved psychology is sort of saying, wait a minute, what am I doing? Don't do this. And there's all of this institutional structure to push people towards. So it's in Aaron Blackwell's data was, people with a lot of family. So there's lots of siblings. They're really, it's the difference between sort of the family being taken care of and not. The financial support if they do it. So you can really see how there's a lot of social structure throwing as many benefits to that individual as possible. And even then, many don't, right? And
Yeah.
even then, there's even just things of like making it so the handler of the person has more control than the person themselves over like actually getting them to do that, because it's really hard to get a human being to like try to kill themselves, and especially when there's ecologically valid,
Yeah.
like evolutionarily recurrent cues of that. Yeah.
I think this is a fundamental problem too that comes along with this, is that we can look across like a conflict setting and we see all these people engaging in violence and behaving very similarly. Like this gets back to your point about how do we distinguish between bargaining and predatory aggression and all these things. And the one circumstance, this person might be doing it because they are trying to protect their family, whereas the other one is doing it because in the end he knows that he'll get a better payoff. And oftentimes, like in ethnic violence, what you see very definitively, it's actually a very small proportion. I think in the new paper I have coming out, it's like I think looking back at that data, is about 16% of the adult male population, right around there, that is the first active starters in Rwanda and Yugoslavia. That and they have a very particular profile. They're generally young, kind of the age of radicalized actors in domestic settings. They have a lot to gain. They have very low social connections with the community. And yeah, so you see like the cost benefit is different for those actors. So if you look across the conflict and all you see is everyone engaging in violence, how do you parse the motivational systems of those different individuals, and how can you ever address how to prevent the violence if you're just kind of saying, oh, that clearly like this is all the same. And we have that even, within a more localized setting like terrorism in a domestic setting, where again, like those actors that are part of terrorist organizations, and we're starting to get a better data here. Some folks in the Netherlands are doing really good work here to look at what's the difference between those that are engaged in terrorist organizations that commit violence versus those that don't. And so I think we're starting with the EP perspective is really, really important, because then we can start to get to the level of granularity that we need, where it's like, why are these different actors acting this way? And they might be quite radically different. And then, into this, I'm still, I love Nancy Cartwright's work on philosophy of science. And she talks a lot about Innes conditions. I don't know if you all have ever but essentially, I won't try to repeat it, but it's a great example of conditions of causality, where, for instance, you can have a condition, but unless it has some other supporting thing, it will never happen. And so it's trying to bring complexity and the complex systems idea back into causality here. So you might have someone that's radicalized to the point to violence, but there's something, just the opportunity is not there, or there's some missing piece. So again, that's even a more complicating factor of how do you parse that psychology, because that person might never act, even though they are truly radicalized, whatever that might mean in this sense.
Yeah. To to kind of to turn this around, is there anything that kind of universally undoes violence? Like I know you told me anecdotes about, sort of people in some sense or one way or another sort of reminding them of their humanity. And that occasionally works. Is that too sort of glib and trite? And, I think people have this intuitive idea, right? To just sort of turn this around from like, we're talking about violence. Is there at least some hope, or like, how do you think about that? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I clearly see it. I mean, a lot of people say there's this issue of low numbers in radicalization, where it's like they're so disproportional, and the number of people that radicalize compared to those that could radicalize but don't. And I think there you're looking at all of, we live in a social world that's very non-zero sum. And I think that's a really good thing, because it helps constrain, violent action. indeed, like, um, the other work on institutionalism and how that can support peace is also another great piece of this that I think is really important to consider. But dang, there was something else that has
Well, I
slipped
was
my
just
mind.
asking. I'm like, even I mean, the anecdote you told me about Croatia, like,
Oh,
I
that's
don't
the
know.
one I was getting to.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah,
So this is the one that still sticks with me,
yeah.
among so many of these things. But this one was a victim of violence, and um, she was with her family. Family was murdered in front of her. She was laying on the ground they were trying to flee a war zone area. They didn't quite make it. They were intercepted by military, and she was laying on the ground. And she was laying there for hours, and she thought they were going to leave her for dead. And one of the soldiers came over and said to her, "How do you want to die?" And he had a bunch of knives, and he was like, "Do you want to die by?" And she looked at him and she said, "Well, I hope that your mother has the same option," or something along those lines. And he kind of dropped and left. And that's how eventually, like, they left her behind, and she was able to get help and get out of there.
And she told you
And I
this, like,
think,
this is a person you met, told you this
yes,
story.
yes.
Yeah.
And so what's happening there? That's a really fascinating. There's something really quite profound that's happening there, as far as kind of appealing to the better angels of our nature. But I think there's so many things that we don't know yet, as far as how can we short circuit violent actors? Like, how can we think in more intuitive ways, better ways of doing so. With the radicalization stuff, for instance, if it is envy, one of the things that the envy system likes to do is put its blame on other people. And what you see is in that literature, the folks that have been dealing with radicalized individuals, trying to get them to de-radicalize, is one of the core focuses is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is getting the person to take responsibility for their position in the social world. And that, so it's like disrupting the natural tendency of those systems to operate. It might be as simple as that in order to revert. So it's not about education, it's not about these other things, but really having actual effects on these cognitive systems that are raising the costs, lowering the benefits, all these different things that I think are have really profound effects, and sometimes for very low cost. So yeah, I think that's a really optimistic thing.
That particular event, I mean, since you told me that, I've thought about it often, and you clearly do too. What is your take on what happened there? Is it that the person, it sort of shifted them out of group-based thinking, and I'm just like, it just made it, I'm an individual doing this thing to this person. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about it a lot,
Yeah.
and it's hard to say exactly,
Sure.
but it's something along those lines. It's something about reorienting, kind of disrupting the play
Yeah.
for
I know
it was a bad
it's a
word, but
technical term. No, yeah, no,
yeah, disrupting the narrative or the script that's being run.
yeah,
And and a lot of these things, the one thing that a lot of the very rarely saw it spoken about in the text. Most of these people that are doing these things are drunk. Most
yeah.
of
Oh,
them
wow.
are. So it takes a lot for a lot of these people to do these really violent things. And so one of the things I kept hearing over and over is every time this group of guys came around, they would get drunk first, and then they would do these really horrible things. So yeah, so I think even in that circumstance, there's still there's this, the different parts of our cognition that if you can find a way to appeal to those, I'm thinking of other examples from areas, but they're all really in poor taste. But I
Yeah.
think if you're, it's the same idea. Like if you're having sex and your family walks in, suddenly that system is interrupted very quickly.
Right.
And so that, I mean, that's a very poor,
Yeah, no, but
crude
it's a
example,
good
and
but
so
it's very clear example, right? Of just and David and I talked about this in a previous episode of there's sometimes an attempt to sort of essentialize the inevitability of any outcome. This is often, just this is what came up in the context of sort of straw man arguments against an evolutionary approach, where it's sort of it justifies like, infidelity in men or something, right? And the idea, like we talked about, is, even if sexual variety is more about positively valued in a male phenotype, there's other adaptations at play too. And the thing that you just talked about is another example of that, right? That there are other adaptations guiding other kinds of motivations. And this anecdote with this, this extremely I don't even know how to describe it. I think it's stupid to try. I mean, to provide an adjective to it. This anecdote, um, it shows the power of there are multiple adaptations in this soldier, and she engaged another one, and it changed
Mhm.
what he did. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and and we always think, yeah, we always think it takes so much, but maybe if we do, uh, maybe if we can figure this out more, then we can find these lower cost solutions to these really grand problems that that we face with violence and global conflict.
Yeah. One question we often ask guests is I think we've done it for everyone, is there something we should have asked you? And then
Oh my
there's and
gosh.
I really and then it gets people I yeah, people don't know what to say, and so I usually fill the time for a moment with
Well,
David. And I need to work on our banter too. We haven't had this is not a good
well,
episode.
also too, when you're talking about
But
violence and
exactly.
conflict, it's
Yeah,
hard to have like silly
exactly.
banter on the side.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I face this a lot with presentations I give because
Right.
back
It's
in the
very
day when
heavy.
I was
Yeah.
working on morality and that,
Yeah.
you can put silly cartoons and you can put images and things, and now
Right.
it just feels, feels so wrong and just
Yeah.
so, to make light of it that you try to
Yeah.
steer completely away from it. But then,
Yeah.
those meetings where you're only like a conflict research meeting can be very dark.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think the only other thing that the other area of my research that I've been working on is really like the policy stuff, um, which we've had a lot of luck working with international lawyers. We've dabbled a bit on this with the ICRC and the UN, and but I think that there's some really interesting stuff there that social scientists are not really yet involved with. Like, so for instance, there's a lot of social scientists that are studying how courtroom biases appear and what those look like. So there's this whole literature, which is a legal empirical literature that's based out of Cornell. However, there's not really social scientists looking at theorizing and applying that to or running experiments that would be applicable to legal issues outside of these very kind of constrained areas. So I think that there's like so much ripe fruit there for social scientists to explore, and a lot of lawyers that are very, very keen. Particularly, a lot of them come from a background in philosophy or social science, or they many of the ones that I've met love learning and love talking about the social sciences. So I think for social scientists, and in policy as well, I was just talking with some colleagues up at in Liverpool about this disconnect also between what policymakers on that side, what they want, and what social scientists provide. And we're both working in the dark. So we do, as social scientists, we research what we're passionate about oftentimes, and then sometimes what our grant money comes from, which we may have differing levels of passion about. But on the policy side, a lot of times they have questions that they want answered, which we're kind of working in two different realms. And besides like the occasional thing, like the EU might put up funding for certain projects that are of policy relevance, but besides that, there's very little connection between practitioners, policymakers, lawyers, and the social sciences. And so I think we just started talking recently about how can we start thinking about solutions where it's like, hey, we really need answers in this particular question or this thing that we're really dealing with, so that social scientists can be more, that the relevance of the research is more aligned with what's needed out there.
So is what you're saying that the connection between basic research and the applied part, where there are people literally doing things like sentencing people to death, making decisions about life and death, or just legal policy in general that has huge impacts. The people who are doing the practical work are ready and willing and able and want scientific input, but there's not currently enough dialogue or connection between scientists and these applied people. And therefore, even the questions that scientists are asking are not informed by that there's this need, for example. And maybe also, is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I mean, I just saw a colleague in the Netherlands the other day, and he said it perfectly when he works a lot with policymakers, and he said, I always feel a bit half-hearted when I end my article and I try to draw policy conclusions from it, because if unless you're doing the research with the policy goal in mind, then you're just kind of saying, oh, this could apply in this way or that way. So the alignment doesn't really exist, and it's a very peculiar thing. I mean, granted, I don't want to give up all my freedom on research, but it's a peculiar thing that there isn't much, more of an alignment when most social scientists are working for the public good,
Yes.
and are, so I think that there's something to be hopefully in the future to be improved there.
Yeah, that's right. And even, I mean, I have met behavioral scientists who are basically like, I don't know what to study.
Yeah,
You know,
no, that's
so
true.
so I mean, it's really a tragedy in that respect of you've got really people who really are doing real things that need answers to questions, and they're not coordinated or hooked up to people who have the means to answer those questions. And there's nobody sort of like with the job. It's like there's like a matchmaking problem. We need like something
Yeah.
like a matchmaking service that is hooking up applied and
We
basic.
need a we need a Tinder where you just
Exactly.
swiping.
Science Tinder.
Uh,
Wow,
but
yeah.
we come full circle to coordination issues and
Yeah,
Yep.
miscoordination in
it's
this
it's
regard.
Coordination, yeah,
coordination. It's
and drag queens.
Yes.
exactly exactly.
Yeah.
Michael, where can people find you right now?
Oh gosh. Well, I just started recently having my own website, so
Great.
michaelmoncrieff.com. So that links to all my other pages and profiles and that. It's under construction, but hopefully it will be improving. Yeah, so that's probably the best way at this point.
Okay, great. And we don't usually do plugs on this, but I will say, like, if what Michael is saying, whenever we post this publicly, if this research seems interesting or important to you, please also reach out to Michael if you're interested in supporting this research, because like anything else that doesn't fit squarely in a pre-existing institutional structure. I mean, the exact problem you're just described is part of the reason why this kind of work doesn't exist is because there's not, support for this kind of work. And so, if anybody who's listening thinks it's important or useful or knows somebody who can support it, please reach out to Michael directly.
Thank you. I will second
Yeah.
that.
But
Thank you so
but
much for having me.
yeah, no, it was a pleasure, and really appreciate you doing this work. And I hope more people join you doing this bridging sort of social science and policy and law. And we're actually going to have some folks on. I think one of our next guests will be Deb Lieberman, who
Oh, I
is
love.
one of the other
Yes.
people. I mean, honestly, of the two, I don't know, you and Deb, can you think of anyone else who's sort of bridging EP and law? I mean, I guess there's a few other folks.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think that there's a handful of
Keela
other.
Williams. Yeah, maybe we should
Of
have her
course,
on.
Keela. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Jamie's best friend.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Michael, yeah, thank you so much. It was great to have you, and wish you all the best luck for this really important work.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right, David, we have completed another episode.
Yes, we did. It was a really good one. And if you agree that it was a good one, don't be shy about it. Tell people on social media, tell a friend, leave us a kind review, support us on Patreon. Yeah.
Yeah, and we really appreciate people talking about us on social media, And please, if you like what we're doing, please tell a friend, somebody who might be interested, or somebody who might hate evolutionary psychology.
Mhm.
We'd love to have people listening who might be critics, and we'd love to hear from people and what they think.
Absolutely. We'll see you next week.
Sounds good. See you next week, David.